Hey everyone, this is PoetrySpoken.com. My name is Seth Perkins in Seattle.
Hey everyone, my name is Veronica Suarez, and I'm in Miami.
And today we're going to be going behind the scenes on our reading of Impressions of Peter in Vietnam, which is from Veronica's book in verse, Nights in the City Beautiful. Veronica, I think I'm going to take
Yes.
the first question on this, if you don't mind. I was going to ask you, the Impressions of Peter is broken up into three different sections, and each section is written very, very differently, not just in terms of how you structured them, but also in terms of the narrator's voice and what we're talking about as we progress through Peter's life in Vietnam. Could you talk to us a little bit just what was going on in your process thinking about Peter as he's now on the other side of the world from Victoria, and what was going through his brain as he traveled through those three distinct sections of this poem?
Okay. So, yeah, in each section, it's not just different in terms of the tone and the voice and the mood and what's going on with Peter, but it's also different in terms of the time period. So in section 1, it's September 2015, and he's in Quignon. And he's photographing there, and we learned a lot about him getting used to the city, falling in love with the city, um, falling in love with Quignon, and just the routine of Peter and his career, and also how much he's missing Victoria. In section 2, and of course we find out that he loves to drink a lot, and he likes to write to her at night. And at this point in the story, they're exchanging a lot of communication through email and through FaceTime as well. And it's very much an epistolary romance that's happening at this time. In section 2, he's motorbiking, and he's leaving from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. And this is a year later. This is around a year later. This is a few months later, in June 2016. And this is all about, Peter, just the daredevil, Peter, the one that is just willing to take all the risk that he needs to take in order to travel and in order to live life to the fullest. And I definitely admire that about him. I admire him driving in the claustrophobic and dangerous city of Hanoi, and how people drive there. That's certainly something that I personally would probably have a hard time doing, but Peter does it very easily. And it's just exciting. And, he's motorbiking, and we learn about what that's like, and we learn what the people are like. And just, it's a very romantic, beautiful setting to write and to travel. And he's in love with traveling. And this is a good thing for him, but it's also a bad thing for his relationship with Victoria. And, because he can't ever really settle down.
Mm-hmm.
And we find out about the different places that he visits as he's motorbiking, and he falls in love with all these places, but he can never fully stay there. And so he's always the perpetual visitor, and the depth that he can get. That's why it's called Impressions of Peter in Vietnam, because he's just always traveling. So he's always getting impressions. He's never getting the full, it's like when you get to know someone, it's not just, in the beginning it's great, but then later on you see all these different layers, these contradictions of when you get to know someone. And the same thing happens when you're getting to know a city, you're the pros and cons. And he's always in this romantic, perpetual romance with traveling, because he doesn't ever have to stay too long in a place to discover all the negative things about it. Not to the point that you would if you were to stay somewhere and live for years and years and years. So he's in perpetual romance. And And that's
He
a
doesn't
good
want
thing.
to
And that's a
commit to any one place.
no, or to any one person. And and in a way that's good because he gets to experience a lot of the world, but there's a depth that he's missing in not just in staying in one place for a long time, but also with, staying in one place for a long time, you get to know people and see all their different layers. So this is about, and so in here we see that he's having a great time, but he's missing Victoria. And yeah. And then in part 3, and then there's of course the awesome Moby Dick reference that I absolutely love. And we can talk about that later if you want. But it's definitely, the sense of adventure is set by the epigraph in the beginning of the poem. And in part 3, he's actually staying in Ho Chi Minh City for some time. And we find out about his childhood and his parents' divorce and the things that make Peter Peter, and sort of the darker side of Peter. So we fall in love with Peter in part 1 and 2, and then in part 3 we start seeing a different side of Peter. So it's a more somber tone to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I liked going into it, seeing the way that you structurally put together the pace of these 3 sections, because section 1 is much more prose-like, and it tends to flow that way, whereas 2 is much more kinetic. Each one of your lines is maybe 5 syllables long, and I think I mentioned to you one time, it kind of had that cadence that made me think of the Beat Generation, and it just had that pulse of somebody on a motorbike turning, zooming, and I love the phrase used in there, like a cod in a school of fish. And that's always the way that he felt to me in that second section. And then you slowed it down again with the third section with these much longer, deliberate phrases. But going back to that, you use this analogy of the, what was it? The motes dancing around the fluorescent light bulb. I love that image that you keep going back to. Just it set this very beautiful tone and kind of this slowly turning solar system that only Peter can see. Was very, very delicate, and that was really, really enjoyable to read.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. And I remember when we were talking about the behind the scenes cinematically, I was telling you, if this was a movie, then we'd have part 1 would be just, we're seeing Peter from third person, and then part 2 we're in the motorbike, and then part 3 we're in his head, so in that sense it's been really interesting to talk about this not just in a literary way but also in terms of film and movies. And speaking of acting and movies, I wanted to ask you your personal experience with shooting this, and just anything you want to share with having to go into the narrator voice and then having to go into Peter's head, and how you went about doing that, and your how you felt about it, and emotionally, if you want to talk about the emotional preparation or the emotional moments that you got into as you were recording this.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny because usually when I'm doing recordings of classic poetry, I don't have William Shakespeare or Byron to look over my shoulder and critique what I'm doing. But in this case, I have access to the author. And when I went through it the first time or two and I read it, I definitely had this feel of the pacing and this kind of this kinetic motion of the motorbike, and that somehow had to be reflected inside of the cadence of the voice. And, again, I was going back to thinking of Howell and Ginsberg and the beat that he created. And then, fortunately, I have access to the author here to look at the video and say, no, you're rushing it a little bit here. And, I want you to think about these particular ideas inside of Peter's head. And I think that's always kind of the challenge for me is I want to understand the character, and I want to understand how the author, I want to be able to look at the work both as the standalone piece. The work has to be able to stand alone by itself without commentary. But then I also want to be able to understand what was going on inside the author's head, and especially with poetry, because you're trying to condense many, many times something that's so profound into a very, very small, set of words. And that's what, one of the things that makes poetry so beautiful and so challenging. And with access to you, it was really trying to wrap my brains around the 2 or 3 kernels of what was going on inside of Peter's head at the time, and also the narrator's head. And I know you and I had that conversation a few times, was I would get really, really deep inside of Peter, but then I had to step back as a narrator, because this isn't Peter talking, this is a narrator talking who sympathizes in some ways not, with what's going on with Peter. And so I would make these little footnotes to myself as I was reading it. At this point, I had to put myself inside of a headspace where I was in section 3, where I was drunk and alone. And I can easily sum up those 2 thoughts in my head and those 2 memories in my head and put myself inside of that space. And then the rest of it just kind of flows through that filter. And it's the same thing with anything that we've discussed in this novel. Is it refers to very, very universal concepts that just about any thinking, breathing, living human being should be able to sum up from their memory. And in this case, it was very, very easy for me to bring up those memories and then be able to occupy Peter and the narrator simultaneously.
Yeah, you did an amazing job. Almost made me cry.
Thank you.
You just did a wonderful job reading impressions
If I can
of
make
Peter.
the author happy, then that makes me happy.
Yeah, and we did. Every take. You would send me every take, and I think on the 4th take, every of the takes was great, but we always like to do more than 1 take, so that in case there's an emotional, because there's always going to be an emotional revelation that you get sometimes that you don't get in another take. And going back to what you were saying about being Peter, or having to inhabit Peter's head, but also be the narrator. So in part 2, it's a 3rd-person limited perspective. And I think that having that little bit of distance from Peter really helps, especially in part 3, because Peter is not the kind of person that is going to tell you all about his life and reveal everything. Mm. So if he was writing this to Victoria in 1st person, then we wouldn't get all these details. We wouldn't get him being so vulnerable. So by having that 3rd-person narrator, we get a more vulnerable Peter. We were able to see a more vulnerable Peter. And I do that in different points in the book. I'll have 3rd-person poems because, obviously the limitations of the 1st person I wanted to have both the intimacy of the 1st person, and then of course in 3rd-person limited, you still have that intimacy, but you're able to see the person in a little bit in a more objective way. And that was really important to me. Just because Peter's he's not a very vulnerable person. So, but you played him beautifully, and I'm really grateful that that you covered this poem.
It was fun. Thanks, everybody, for coming to our behind the scenes of Impressions of Peter in Vietnam. I had a great time doing it.
I had a terrific time. This was a lot of fun.
If you're on YouTube, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate every single word people have sent our way.
Absolutely. And if you're on Instagram, if you're watching this on Instagram, be sure to follow, like, and share this, and leave comments if you want. And I really appreciate everyone who has followed us. I know a lot of my people are on there. And we're going to be releasing more of these videos, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's following us and subscribing and all of that.
Yeah, I'm excited to make more of these videos. So we will see you soon. Thank you.
Take care until next time.